immediately grab attention, immerse the audience in danger, and establish Bumpy Johnson as a legendary, untouchable figure. The night in Harlem was thick with whispers. A quiet unease had settled over the streets, heavier than any fog the city had seen. Some say the city itself seemed to hold its breath as though aware that something monumental was about to unfold. It began with rumors of a plan so audacious, so deadly, that it sent shivers through even the most hardened criminals. Dutch Schultz, a man whose name alone could crack nerves, had dispatched 12 killers to end the life of one man. Bumpy Johnson. Some say he was untouchable. Others believed he was merely a man of extraordinary cunning who had survived long enough to seem invincible. Yet here, in the shadows of Harlem's alleys, even the whispers carried fear. 12 men, each trained in violence, each confident in their lethal skill, had been sent into a city they did not know. They carried weapons, plans, and arrogance, but none understood that they were about to face more than a man. They were about to face a legend. The streets were alive with tension, though nothing had yet occurred. Windows rattled with a distant hum of streetcars, lamplights flickered in the alleys, casting shadows that seemed to twitch with anticipation. Harlem was no stranger to violence, yet something about this night was different. The air felt electric, heavy with the promise of chaos. Every corner, every doorway, every flicker of movement could hide a threat or an opportunity. Those who knew Bumpy understood. He did not act rashly, but when he did act, it was precise, inevitable, and absolute. Some say Bumpy had been expecting them for days. Others whispered that the city itself warned him the way the street vendors moved, the way the cats darted across the alleys, the unusual quiet from certain clubs. He walked those streets with calm, almost imperceptible movements. He was a silhouette among silhouettes, blending into Harlem as though he were a part of it, yet always above it, observing, calculating. His eyes missed nothing. His mind anticipated every move, every whisper, every footstep. And the 12 men moving through Harlem that night were about to find out that intelligence, timing, and fear were deadlier than any weapon. The first of Dutch Schultz's men entered the city from the east. Some say he was confident, carrying himself like a man who had never known defeat. Others suggest he sensed the tension immediately, a quiet alarm that made his hand twitch near the handle of his gun. He moved silently, blending into the shadows, unaware that every step was observed, every sound analyzed. Bumpy's men, or perhaps Harlem itself, watched from hidden vantage points. Shadows shifted unnaturally, corners held secrets, and the killer's instincts were tested in ways he had never imagined. As the second and third assassins joined him, the city seemed to grow smaller, claustrophobic, as though the streets themselves were narrowing in on them. Some witnesses, who would later speak only in whispers, claim they saw Bumpy standing in an alley, unseen yet omnipresent, his posture calm, deliberate. A man who was never truly there, yet always in control. The killers did not know it yet, but the city had become a labyrinth designed to test their nerves, their patience, and their courage. Some say it was a trap. Others say it was the natural consequence of entering Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, uninvited. Time stretched. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became hours. The tension was palpable. Every shadow seemed to breathe. Some say that even the rats of Harlem sensed a danger, fleeing the alleys where men of death had come to hunt. Some witnesses would later recall the way streetlights flickered, almost as though acknowledging that something monumental was unfolding beneath their light. And in that quiet, the audience feels the mounting suspense, the near impossible odds, and the inevitability of confrontation. Bumpy, meanwhile, moved with purpose. Some say he never left his home that night. Others believe he walked the streets unseen, positioning, observing, preparing. Every encounter he had, every gaze he cast, was a calculated step in a plan that would reduce 12 of Dutch Schultz's men to nothing more than whispers of failure. The audience begins to sense that Bumpy's power was not just physical, it was psychological. He could turn fear into a weapon. He could manipulate the most confident of killers with nothing more than his presence, timing, and the weight of reputation. Hours passed, yet no shots rang out. Some say Bumpy wanted them to feel dread first, to experience the paralysis of uncertainty. Others whisper that he allowed the city itself to unsettle them. Alleyways felt longer. Shadows moved faster. Every step carried with it a sense of inevitable reckoning, and, as the audience is drawn deeper into the story, They understand that the suspense is not simply for entertainment, is a narrative tool, a cinematic device to illustrate the near impossible odds against which Bumpy thrives. The first fatal mistake occurred without blood. One of Schultz's men, confident and unaware, chose the wrong street, underestimating both Harlem and the man it protected. He paused, listening. He thought he saw movement. Some say it was a shadow, others claim it was Bumpy himself, watching. A chill ran down his spine. He tightened his grip on his weapon, unaware that he had already stepped into a psychological trap. Fear, invisible yet palpable, began to seep into the group. The audience experiences this fear too, suspense heightened, hearts racing, anticipation of the inevitable collision. As midnight approached, the city seemed alive with the story being written. Each of the 12 men was being tested. Some would succumb to their own doubt, some to the subtle manipulations that Bumpy and his environment created. Some say Bumpy communicated with Harlem itself, speaking in signs only the initiated could read. Others believe the city responded, guiding him, protecting him, turning every alley and every shadow into a barrier for those who sought his death. The audience is aware that these 12 killers, trained, armed, and confident, are walking a path paved with their own uncertainty. By the end of the night, the legend begins to crystallize. 11 of the 12 men falter, retreat, or fail in ways that do not need to be witnessed directly. The suspense is psychological, cinematic, and almost unbearable. One man remains, carrying with him the story that will define Bumpy's myth, survivor who will deliver the message. But for now, the audience experiences the tension, the near impossible odds, and the quiet understanding that Bumpy Johnson is not merely a man. He is a force, a calculated, patient, omnipresent mind capable of surviving. 12 killers sent by one of the most feared gangsters of the era. Some say this night defined him. Others insist it was merely one of many trials he survived. But what is certain, what the audience feels in every narrated pause, every shadow described, and every heartbeat counted, is that Harlem witnessed the making of legend. A man who could face 12 assassins and emerge unscathed is no longer just a figure in the underworld. He is myth, and the city itself, in hushed tones and flickering lights, bore witness to his indomitable will, his intelligence, and the near odds he turned into inevitability. Develop audience empathy, show formative struggles, and explain the intelligence, patience, and strategy that made Bumpy capable of surviving impossible odds. Bumpy Johnson's story did not begin in the shadows of Harlem's alleys, nor in the whispers of its underground clubs. It began in hardship, in the unforgiving streets of a world that demanded vigilance, cunning, and resilience. Some say he was born with the instincts of a survivor, though few could see it in the boy who wandered the city with cautious eyes, alert to every movement. Others believe the city itself molded him, shaping his mind through necessity, danger, and the quiet lessons of observation. Every alley he navigated, every fleeting encounter with crime or betrayal, became a building block in the architecture of the man who would one day face 12 assassins and emerge unscathed. As a child, Bumpy learned quickly that the world was not fair. The city was divided between those with power and those without, and he existed firmly on the side of those who had none. Poverty pressed against him like a tangible weight. Hunger gnawed, and threats were never far from sight. He witnessed violence as casually as others might witness traffic on the street, neighbors disappearing overnight, rumors of killings whispered in alleys, and the constant tension of living under eyes that watched every misstep. Yet within this chaos, Bumpy cultivated patience. Some say he would sit quietly for hours, observing interactions, memorizing patterns, learning which words, glances, or gestures could signal danger or opportunity. Early hustles marked his adolescence. He moved with caution, testing the boundaries of survival and ethics in a world that offered little room for error. Street corners became his classrooms. Card games, small-time thefts, and hustles were not merely for money, they were exercises in psychology. He studied people, their weaknesses, their fears, their pride. Some say he could detect lies before they left the lips of even the most practiced liar. Others insist he could manipulate outcomes with a single glance, a casual remark, or a careful act that seemed innocuous to all but him. These early experiences sharpened him, turning survival into a game of observation and strategy. Yet it was not only the streets that taught Bumpy family. community, and loss shaped him just as profoundly. He watched his friends succumb to bad choices, as mentors betrayed, and as those who seemed invincible fell victim to the consequences of carelessness. He learned that loyalty was fragile, that trust must be earned, and that patience often outweighed brute strength. Some say these lessons hardened him. Others believe they imbued him with a kind of quiet intelligence that would later become his greatest weapon. Every hardship became a stepping stone, every failure a lesson in calculation. Education, though informal, was a cornerstone of his development. Bumpy read voraciously books, newspapers, pamphlets absorbing knowledge that extended beyond the streets. Some say he understood politics, economics, and law in ways that rivaled men twice his age. Others whisper that his true education came from life itself, the observation of human behavior, the consequences of actions, and the patterns that emerged in chaos. He learned that information was power, and power could be wielded without violence. The young Bumpy internalized these lessons with the precision of a master strategist, preparing for battles that no one yet knew would come. By his teenage years, Bumpy was no longer a boy navigating survival. He was a tactician, a strategist, and a young man quietly earning the respect of those around him. Small-time alliances formed under his guidance. Rivalries tested his patience and judgment. Some say he could broker peace among men who would otherwise have killed each other. Others insist that he could predict conflict before it happened, positioning himself advantageously without anyone realizing the game being played. Each success, no matter how small, reinforced his growing reputation for intelligence and foresight. Yet, even in the formative years, danger was never far. Bumpy faced threats that would have undone lesser men, attempted robberies, beatings, and encounters with gangs who tested his resolve. Each challenge became a lesson, each near-fatal encounter a blueprint for survival. He learned the art of reading intent, understanding psychology, and calculating timing. Some say he could anticipate violence before it erupted, sensing tension in a room, movement in a crowd, or hesitation in a man's gaze. Others believe he simply learned to wait, to act at the precise moment when opportunity and risk aligned. Perfectly. Bumpy's early years were also marked by moral ambiguity. He was neither saint nor monster. He was a man shaped by circumstance, intelligence, and instinct. Some say he learned to bend rules without breaking them entirely. Others suggest he mastered the subtle art of intimidation without unnecessary cruelty. These lessons became essential later in life, when survival was no longer measured by strength alone but by perception, timing, and reputation. The foundations laid in these early years enabled him to survive encounters that would have destroyed men far older and more experienced. Influence and observation became central to his approach. Bumpy learned not to act immediately, to measure the impact of words and actions, and to anticipate responses. He understood the currency of respect, how it could protect, how it could manipulate, and how it could build networks of loyalty that were invisible to outsiders. Some say he could command obedience with a single glance. Others whisper that he could sow discord among his enemies with a carefully timed word or act. These formative skills would define him, turning the young boy who walked the streets of Harlem into a man whose intellect and strategy would become the stuff of legend. And yet, despite his intelligence, Bumpy never lost touch with the human stakes. He understood fear, desire, and loyalty not as abstract concepts, but as tangible forces shaping lives and destinies. Some say he could sense a man's breaking point. Others insist he recognized opportunity where others only saw danger. These insights allowed him to survive and thrive where others failed. Every encounter, every risk, every lesson became part of a mental arsenal that would later allow him to face 12 men sent by one of the most feared gangsters in America. Unflinching and unbeaten. By the time he reached adulthood, Bumpy Johnson had transformed from a boy of necessity into a man of strategy, patience, and foresight. Some say the streets themselves acknowledged him, bending subtly to his presence. Others believe his reputation was earned through a series of calculated risks, alliances, and victories that few outside Harlem would ever witness. What is certain is that the young man who had walked the alleys, observed the patterns of men, and survived countless dangers had become capable of turning impossible odds into inevitability. This foundation, built in the crucible of Harlem's unforgiving streets, laid the groundwork for the night when Dutch Schultz would send 12 men to kill him. Some would fail, some would retreat, One would survive to tell the tale, and all of them would encounter, in one way or another, the quiet, lethal intelligence of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for moments like this. Bumpy Johnson had become more than a man. He had become a legend, shaped by hardship, sharpened by experience, and tempered by intellect. And as the audience follows this backstory, they begin to understand when the 12 men entered Harlem. They were not just facing Bumpy Johnson, they were facing a lifetime of preparation, a mind honed for survival, and a myth that had been decades in the making. Illustrate Bumpy Johnson's ascent in Harlem, emphasizing intelligence, strategic dominance, and mythic reputation, preparing the audience for the deadly confrontation ahead. Bumpy Johnson's rise to power was not marked by simple violence or reckless ambition. From his early years, he had learned that the streets favored patience, intelligence, and foresight over brute force. What began as survival instinct evolved into a strategic mastery of Harlem's underworld, a web of alliances, rivalries, and reputations that few could navigate successfully. Some say he moved silently, a shadow among shadows, building influence, not through intimidation alone, but through respect earned, trust cultivated, and fear subtly instilled. Others believe that the myth of Bumpy Johnson became self-reinforcing. The stories of his cunning, whispered from club to alley, made enemies hesitate before challenging him, and allies follow his guidance without question. By the time he reached adulthood, Bumpy had already begun consolidating power. Small-time hustles grew into networks of influence, not through force, but through an uncanny understanding of human psychology. He recognized loyalty as currency and reputation as armor. He observed the ambitions of rivals, the weaknesses in their operations, and the cracks in their alliances. Some say he could dismantle a gang without raising a weapon. Others claim he could sway votes in political circles with a word or a glance. He understood that fear could protect him, but respect could multiply his power exponentially. And so, he moved strategically, positioning himself as both protector and enforcer, a man who could deliver punishment when necessary, but whose intelligence alone often made punishment unnecessary. Harlem, during this period, was a city of constant negotiation, subtle violence, and unspoken codes. The competition was fierce, and the stakes were high. Bumpy Johnson navigated this landscape like a grandmaster playing chess, several moves ahead of anyone else. Some say he brokered truces between warring factions with nothing more than his presence. Others believe he orchestrated silent power, plays that left rival gangs undermined and disoriented without ever realizing it. Every decision, every conversation, and every alliance was calculated, building a network of influence that extended far beyond Harlem streets. His reputation began to precede him. Some whispered in clubs that crossing Bumpy was a death sentence. Even if it didn't immediately result in violence, it guaranteed misfortune. Others claimed he could predict betrayal before it happened, observing the smallest cues in posture, tone, or glance. Stories circulated of men who underestimated him and found themselves financially ruined, socially isolated, or mysteriously removed from Harlem streets. These stories were often ambiguous, bordering on myth. Some say he never raised his hand against them. Others insist the consequences were swift and brutal. Regardless, the perception of power reinforced itself, and the legend of Bumpy Johnson grew with each passing year. Alliances were essential to his strategy. Bumpy carefully selected confidants, ensuring that those closest to him were both competent and loyal. Some say he tested them relentlessly, putting their intelligence, courage, and discretion to the test. Others whisper that he created challenges designed to reveal true character, separating those who could be trusted from those who would falter in the face of pressure. He rewarded loyalty, punished betrayal subtly yet effectively, and cultivated an aura of inevitability and understanding that his plans, once set in motion, could not easily be disrupted. In this way, he fortified his position not only through skill but through careful human calculus. The combination of intelligence, strategy, and mythic presence made Bumpy a figure that both friends and foes had to reckon with. Some say that even law enforcement respected him, not out of fear of bribery, but out of recognition of his tactical genius. Others believe that his influence reached into the political and economic structures of Harlem, allowing him to manipulate outcomes without overt violence. His power was psychological, and it was absolute. Every move he made, every conversation he held, every alliance he formed contributed to a narrative of inevitability. Bumpy Johnson was a man who could not be caught off guard, a man whose reputation was both shield and sword. Despite his growing influence, Bumpy remained calculated and patient. He did not seek confrontation unnecessarily. Some say he observed conflicts unfold from the periphery, intervening only when necessary, often in ways that left his enemies confused and demoralized. Others insist that his mere presence in Harlem was enough to stabilize situations in his favor. Rival gangsters would pause before acting, unsure whether their own ambition or their fear of Bumpy would dictate the outcome. Allies, meanwhile, found themselves empowered, protected, and guided by a man whose decisions were both enigmatic and brilliantly effective. His growing influence was not limited to human networks. Bumpy understood the power of perception, optics, and legend. He cultivated an image that extended beyond his immediate environment. Some say he deliberately spread stories of improbable feats, calculated rumors that painted him as more than human, a strategist who could survive impossible odds, a mind that anticipated every threat, and a man whose intelligence rivaled any weapon. Others argue that Harlem itself played a role, amplifying the narrative of his invincibility through gossip, observation, and communal storytelling. Regardless of the method, the legend of Bumpy Johnson became inseparable from the man himself. As Bumpy consolidated power, Dutch Schultz took notice. Some say Schultz underestimated him, seeing only the streets and the manpower, failing to grasp the intelligence that underpinned Bumpy's rise. Others claim Schultz had heard the stories, but dismissed them as exaggeration, mere folklore of the underworld. What Schultz did not anticipate was that Bumpy's reputation was earned through meticulous planning, strategic alliances, and a psychological mastery that few could rival. By the time the 12 men were dispatched, Bumpy had become more than a figure to fear. He was a calculated force of inevitability, even in moments of apparent peace. Bumpy continued to build his power. Some say he played long games with rivals, planting seeds of loyalty and doubt alike, cultivating influence that would only reveal itself when necessary. Others believe he quietly neutralized threats before they could fully materialize, allowing the perception of omnipotence to grow unchecked. He understood that in Harlem, power was as much about perception as reality. The mere idea of Bumpy Johnson could manipulate behavior, provoke fear, and enforce order without a single violent act. By the time Dutch Schultz's 12 men entered Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's rise was complete. He had transformed from a boy of survival into a man whose mind, strategy, and reputation made him untouchable. Some say he welcomed the challenge. Others insist he merely observed, letting his enemies reveal themselves to him. Either way, the streets of Harlem were his chessboard, and the killers were about to move into a game they could not hope to win. The legend was clear. Bumpy Johnson was no ordinary gangster. He was a strategist, a tactician, and a master of perception. He understood fear, loyalty, and timing in ways that others could not comprehend. Some say his reputation alone was enough to alter the course of events. Others believe it was his brilliance, his ability to calculate and anticipate, that made him untouchable. By the time the night of confrontation arrived, Harlem already knew the outcome in its whispers. The stage was set, the players positioned, and one man, silent yet omnipresent, prepared to turn impossible odds into inevitability. And as the audience absorbs this rise to power, they begin to understand why 12 killers sent by one of the most feared gangsters in America were about to face not just a man, but a legend. Bumpy Johnson's influence, intelligence, and mythic presence had been decades in the making. His reputation was his armor, his strategy, his weapon, and his calm observation the force that would ensure that only one of Schultz's 12 men walked out of Harlem alive. Introduce immediate danger, heighten suspense, and emphasize Bumpy's tactical awareness and psychological dominance. The night air in Harlem carried an unusual chill, one that hinted at more than the cold. It carried anticipation, tension, and the weight of imminent danger. Dutch Schultz's 12 men had arrived, crossing the threshold of a city that was not theirs, a city they did not understand. Harlem moved around them with a rhythm they could not predict, a pulse of streets, alleys, and whispers that seemed to test their courage with every step. The killers walked confidently, armed, trained, and certain that their mission, kill Bumpy Johnson, would end as planned. But what they did not know was that the city itself belonged to him, and every corner, shadow, and sound was already part of a strategy designed to unravel them. Some say Bumpy had anticipated their arrival for days, perhaps weeks. Others claim that Harlem itself whispered warnings to him, the flicker of streetlights, the unusual silence of the night, the subtle cues of its residents. He moved silently, almost imperceptibly, blending into the rhythm of the city while observing every step, every breath of the intruders. His presence was everywhere and nowhere. He was the calm in the storm, the observer whose eyes missed nothing, whose mind calculated everything. The audience begins to sense that this is not simply a confrontation of men, it is a battle of intelligence, perception, and nerves. The first of Schultz's men entered from the east, moving along streets that seemed ordinary to anyone else. They carried weapons, packs, and confidence, unaware that each movement was being scrutinized. Some say they felt it immediately, a sense of being watched, a cold prickle of unease running down their spines. Others insist that the city itself shifted around them, its alleys stretching unnaturally, its shadows deepening, as if conspiring against these outsiders. The audience feels it too, an almost suffocating tension that grows with every step, every pause, every whispered footfall. As the second and third men joined the first, the dynamic changed. The killers began to whisper among themselves, testing each other's resolve, sharing brief observations of their surroundings. Some noticed shadows that seemed deliberate, patterns that felt unnatural. Some say they glimpsed figures at the edges of vision, only to turn and see nothing. Their confidence wavered as the urban labyrinth seemed to fold in around them. Harlem, a city they believed they could navigate through force and skill alone, became a psychological maze designed to test nerves and patience. The audience experiences this uncertainty, tension building with each misstep. By the time half of the 12 men had entered Harlem, subtle signs of chaos were already taking shape. A trash can overturned seemingly by accident. A cat darted across the street, drawing the attention of one of the men just enough to break his focus. Some witnesses, later recounting the night in hushed tones, claimed the city itself seemed alive, aware of the trespassers. Others attributed it to Bumpy's meticulous observation, his ability to manipulate the environment, turning each street and alley into a tool of suspense and control. Each subtle disruption chipped away at the assassin's confidence, setting the stage for the inevitable unraveling. Bumpy himself remained unseen. Some say he watched from rooftops, moving silently, calculating the psychological impact of every sound and shadow. Others believe he was already on the ground, a phantom, among the alleys, studying their patterns, noting hesitation, and planting subtle traps. The audience is drawn into a tense game of cat and mouse. The killers are skilled, armed, and trained, yet they are outmatched, not in strength, but in perception. Every moment is designed to heighten suspense, as each step the assassins take carries the weight of potential disaster. Time stretched unnaturally that night. Minutes felt like hours, and every pause carried anticipation of violence. Some of Schultz's men began to doubt themselves. Whispers of uncertainty spread among them, subtle, almost invisible cracks in their coordination. Some argued briefly, others simply froze, scanning their surroundings with growing unease. Fear, invisible yet palpable, began to erode their confidence. The audience too feels this tension. The impossibility of the odds becomes a psychological experience, a slow, almost unbearable build-up toward confrontation. The environment played its role as much as Bumpy did. Streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that created illusions of movement. Doors creaked open, corners seemed to twist unnaturally, and the usual sounds of Harlem did. Music, conversation, footsteps became markers of unseen forces. Some say Bumpy orchestrated these moments himself, leveraging the city as a tool of intimidation. Others suggest that the legend surrounding him amplified the fear, turning ordinary urban noises into signs of an impending reckoning. Either way, the 12 men began to feel that Harlem itself had become hostile, bending in ways they could not anticipate. Some of the killers split off, trying to cover more ground, believing that numbers and strategy would secure them success. But with each step, they were drawn into Bumpy's psychological traps. One would pause at a shadow that seemed to shift. Another would hear a faint sound and spin, only to find nothing. Some say the city itself conspired with him, corners narrowing, pathways confusing, obstacles appearing as if by design. Others claim Bumpy used his knowledge of human behavior to manipulate their fears, to make them doubt each other and to sow hesitation that would prove fatal. The audience is held in suspense, aware that each misstep is a move in a deadly game. They are not trained to see that the tension escalated as the first visible sign of unraveling appeared. One of Schultz's men misread a sound, perhaps a rat scurrying, perhaps a shifted shadow, and some say his hesitation triggered a cascade. Others insist it was the inevitable outcome of walking into a city dominated by a man whose mind was a weapon. The killers began to second-guess each other, coordination faltering, and patience giving way to fear, Bumpy observed, calculating, allowing the psychological pressure to build before any direct action was necessary. By midnight, the night had become a theater of suspense. The remaining men were no longer confident, they were cautious, tense, and uncertain of what was real. Some say they felt an invisible hand guiding their missteps. Others believe they were simply victims of their own arrogance. Harlem, under Bumpy Johnson's influence, had transformed from a city into a labyrinth, each street and shadow a test of nerves. The audience experiences every heartbeat, every pause, and every near-miss as if they too were walking these streets, sensing the danger but unable to act. As the night wore on, the inevitability of failure became clear. Some of the killers retreated, quietly swallowed by the labyrinth of streets and shadows. Some hesitated, only to stumble into situations that exposed them to fear, confusion, and the quiet, strategic presence of Bumpy Johnson. The audience begins to understand that this is not merely a story of men with guns, it is a story of intelligence, patience, and psychological mastery. One by one, the 12 men are tested beyond their skill and training, confronted with a force that is both human and mythic. By the end of the night, only one of Schultz's assassins remained. Exhausted, shaken, and unsure of reality, he carried with him the story that would define Bumpy's legend. Some say the man emerged physically unharmed but mentally transformed, carrying the weight of fear and respect. Others insist that what he witnessed in Harlem was more than survival, it was a demonstration of intellect, perception, and inevitability. Harlem had been the battleground, Bumpy Johnson the strategist, and the 12 men a test of mythic proportions. And so, as the audience watches, the stage is set for the next chapter. Bumpy Johnson has demonstrated that even trained killers, sent by one of the most feared gangsters in America, are no match for preparation, strategy, and psychological dominance. The streets of Harlem, alive with suspense, whispers, and shadows, have become an extension of Bumpy himself. The impossibility of the odds, the tension, and the mythic presence of one man create a narrative that will resonate throughout the story. In Harlem, no plan, no weapon, no training can outmatch the mind of Bumpy Johnson. Showcase Bumpy's intelligence, cunning, and psychological dominance as he systematically neutralizes the assassins, emphasizing suspense and mythic presence. By the time Harlem streets grew heavy with the weight of Schultz's 12 men, the city had already begun to reveal the invisible architecture of Bumpy Johnson's strategy. Some say he had anticipated every move, long before the killers arrived. Every alley they would traverse, every shadow they would misinterpret, every instinct they would betray. Others insist that Bumpy did not merely anticipate. He orchestrated. Harlem itself became an extension of his mind, each corner, doorway, and flicker of lamplight, a tool in a game that only he understood fully. The audience feels it in the tension, a city alive with anticipation, a legend moving unseen, and men trained to kill rendered uncertain, fearful, and uncoordinated. The 12 men moved cautiously, armed and confident, yet they were already disarmed, by perception alone. Some say they noticed the subtle irregularities first, the way shadows moved too deliberately, the faint rustle of an alley cat that seemed calculated, the feeling of being watched in places no one should have been observing. Their training told them to act, to strike quickly and decisively, yet the environment had frozen them in place. Their minds were playing against them, filling the gaps with fear. The audience experiences the suspense with them, aware that every hesitation magnifies the inevitability of Bumpy's control. Bumpy himself remained hidden, almost mythic in presence. Some say he observed from rooftops, calculating angles of approach and exit with meticulous precision. Others believe he blended into the darkness at street level, his silhouette never fully seen, his movements imperceptible but decisive. Every twitch, every sound, every whisper of wind was catalogued, analyzed, and used to manipulate the men who had entered his city with lethal intent. This was not a confrontation of strength, it was a demonstration of intellect, patience, and psychological mastery. The audience feels the growing tension, knowing that the killers, despite weapons and training, were being outmaneuvered at every turn. The first man to falter did so almost imperceptibly. Some say a misplaced step or an uneven pavement revealed him to Bumpy's awareness. Others insist that the boy, already uneasy from hours of paranoia, misread the city itself as a threat. His hand trembled on the gun, his confidence eroded by an invisible force. From the shadows, Bumpy's influence worked like a silent predator. Subtle cues, strategic sounds, the impression of an unseen observer that unnerved even the most confident. The audience senses that the battle is no longer one of bullets, but of nerves and intellect. One by one, the killers began to show cracks. Subtle gestures betrayed fear, a hand trembling slightly, a hesitation in step, an eye darting too quickly. Some say Bumpy amplified these weaknesses through whispers of manipulation, creating illusions of movement, misdirection, and danger. Others suggest the city itself played a role, guiding the killers into psychological traps that left them every decision. The suspense builds with each passing moment. Every corner could hide Bumpy, every shadow could conceal disaster, and every sound could be a signal of their inevitable downfall. As the night deepened, Bumpy began to orchestrate the chaos in a more deliberate fashion. Some say he set simple, almost imperceptible traps. Objects shifted subtly to suggest movement, footsteps echoed unnaturally, and streetlights flickered at key moments. Others believe he relied entirely on the psychology of fear, using the killers' own minds against them. The audience experiences the tension, watching the hunters become the hunted, not through direct confrontation, but through manipulation so precise it seems almost supernatural. The assassin's confidence eroded further with every misstep. Some split off, trying to flank the invisible threat. Others hesitated, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. Some whispered, attempting to regain coordination, yet their words betrayed the nervousness that now dominated their minds. Bumpy observed all of it with quiet precision. Some say he could anticipate every reaction, predict every hesitation, and guide the flow of fear like a conductor directing a symphony. The suspense is almost unbearable. The audience understands that this is a man who has turned instinct, experience, and observation into weapons more lethal than any firearm. By midnight, the psychological pressure on the 12 men became nearly intolerable. Some say the city itself conspired with Bumpy, turning alleys into traps, shadows into false threats, and ordinary sounds into signals of danger. Others claim that the mere reputation of Bumpy Johnson, the stories whispered across Harlem, the tales of improbable survival and cunning amplified their fear. The audience feels it too. Tension layered upon tension, a city alive with menace, and a man unseen commanding the narrative.